And so the part of the goal of this consideration is thinking about perhaps conventional and less than conventional political actions. So what can we consider to be maybe more common, ordinary, expected, but also what is less conventional in terms of individual political actions, but also group political actions. So political actions don't have to be individual; they can be group actions, and we're going to see how um, these actions are organized, coordinated, and if you actually think about everyday life. For example, this past maybe 3, 4 days, there has been quite a bit of political actions, perhaps less conventional. So no one is voting anymore. No one is trying to get the vote out, but people are still organizing in some ways. For example, storming certain places of business or certain individuals associated with certain political activity. And by this, I mean perhaps Elon Musk. Um, and so we shall also maybe think about what interest groups are, what political parties are. Well, maybe we won't talk really much about political parties, but we shall highlight some actions that are undertaken by political parties and actions by individuals, but also interest groups. What is an interest group? What are their strategies? What are their constraints? So, for example, when you think of people who are interested or invested in combating climate change, how do they go about that? What are the constraints under which they operate? And actually, this probably brings us to a very interesting example. Most of you might be familiar with Bloomberg. Um, he used to be mayor of New York. Now he's just like super wealthy. And so, if you actually think about maybe less conventional individual political actions that tie into interest groups. He, for example, recently decided that he was going to pay the US um, obligation to the Paris Climate Accords, which is quite a bit of money, 780 million. And so, as an individual who has money, he is pursuing an interest, climate change, and clearly he probably has some constraints in that he is not doing this for the United States government. Um, but again, you can see individuals' strategies, interests. But also think about political parties and how they see their role, what they do, and sometimes don't do. So, for example, right now, we hear a lot about what political parties are doing or not doing as changes occur in the government. And so we begin, I think, with thinking about political participation and what it entails. So there's a simple definition that all the political actions by individuals and groups entail political participation. So it could be individuals, it could be groups. And so what they seek to do by these actions is influencing the actions or selection of political rulers. So political actions by individuals last fall led to the selection of a ruler. Now, not even going to think about how we feel about that, but again, this is non-ideological. It's about thinking about definitions. And again, I want us to go back to remembering how we spoke of the difference between um, learning about politics and doing politics. So here we focus on learning about politics. Now, individuals can have significant impacts on policy, on groups, on state action, and those who have followed Aung San Suu Kyi will remember that she was a very significant voice of democracy. She actually won the Nobel Peace Prize, and um, then there was a lot of talk about maybe taking back the Nobel Peace Prize because she was under house arrest for maybe 20 years. And then she was eventually freed, probably the most pro-democracy activist. It's a strange story about an American who decided to go and rescue her and swam across a lake or something. She was under house arrest, but she left the house but couldn't leave the compound. But eventually she was released. Now, when she was released, the country of Myanmar, which used to be known as Burma, actually made new laws that made sure that she could not become the country's leader. So again, she was very, very, very popular. But because she was married to a British person, apparently she had abandoned her Myanmar or Burmese heritage. And so again, you can sort of see that not only do individuals affect nations, nations can also change in response to individuals, and this is what we see with Aung San Suu Kyi. So from about 2012, she started working with the Myanmar military junta, and most pro-democracy activists thought that she had sold out, but her arguments were very interesting, and she was arguing that sometimes you have to be in government in order to change government. That didn't really happen, so actually right now she has fallen out with the government again, not because she was criticizing what is alleged to be genocide of the group that is known as Rohingya. But again, it's important to see how individuals affect nations. One could look at the United States right now, for example, and ask how party politics have changed. So the brand of politics that has changed to maybe leverage individuals over party, individuals over ideology, and whether this is necessarily a good thing. Should ideology be more prevalent, or should individuals have? But again, individuals can have those impacts, but so they can also now. When we think about modes of political activity, we can think about individuals engaging in political action, which is basically what people do when they contribute money, when they volunteer, when they go door to door, registering individuals. I think maybe it was last week that I saw examples of this political action, individuals collecting signatures for this is an election in Virginia in November, and hopefully you know about this, for governor, and actually the whole government, so the Senate and the House of Delegates. And so individuals can choose to engage in political action in certain ways, so collecting signatures for someone to run. But also the question of conventional political activity. So, for example, voting, going to political rallies, maybe things like donating money, or knocking on doors, or manning phone banks, so you can call people and ask them about issues and who they are voting for, and maybe encourage them to vote for. So all of this is conventional political action. there are unconventional political activities that run the whole. So some people will write, for example, to their senators or representatives. Some people will actually travel to their offices. Some people will um, do other maybe less conventional political activities. So, and I don't know how to delicately mention this, but during the previous election, there were two alleged attempts on the on one candidate's life, so attempted assassination. Now, the question of whether this is one political action, and we can debate whether, for example, extra-legal activities can be considered political activity, even though, for example, advocating for succession, as some people in Texas do, can also be considered political action that is perhaps less conventional more than it is more conventional. And so there are actions can be, now we have to maybe think about actions and whether they are political. If you go to a coffee shop and buy coffee, that is not necessarily political action. It has political implications, and the way you might think about these political implications is you are paying taxes. What happens to taxes? Who decides what happens to taxes? Are they going to make or repair a local road, or are they going to maybe the state coffers? Is that local tax, or is it state tax, or is it national tax? Every time you go to a gas station and refuel, you don't think of it as political action, but it's action that has political implications and consequences. And so we, in our daily lives, we don't necessarily think of the things that we do as having political implications or being political in nature, but there are these actions that can be political. And so we have to sort of think about what is political and what is overtly political and what is not. What are actions that we do in the daily course of our lives that have political implications? And also the question of, are there actions that we take that do not have any political implications? If you hang out with friends, does that have any political implications? Now, if you go to a political rally, or if you get together with friends and you begin to register people to vote, that has political implications. And so when we sort of think about political activity, we can sort of think about how involved we are, or think about that as activism, but also think about how conventional the action is. And so we can see the axis going from conventional action to unconventional action. Thinking about the extent of activism, so no political activism or very high political activism. And so, for example, if we think about the meeting point of low political activism in terms of conventional political activity, then we arrive at apathy. There are people who are like, I do not care about politics. I do not care if there's a president, a king. I really don't care. And so that would be probably apathy. They don't vote. They do not care who rules. They don't care about, yeah. Now, that is not to say that the things that they do not have political implications. Now, if we think about maybe and so if you think about political activism, there are people who are really, really invested. Like they'll go to rallies every other week or every so often. They'll volunteer. They will do different kinds of things. But if you think about the least involved, low stakes, political activism that is conventional, then you arrive at voting. Um, whether it's finding or requesting an absentee ballot, or perhaps showing up on that particular day to vote, then that would be conventional political activism that is very low stakes. Now, of course, there are some things that people have to do. For example, are you registering to vote, or are you going on same day voting? But then when we go up to conventional activities or activism, we see other political engagement. So, for example, some people are really concerned about single issues, environment, Chesapeake Bay, I don't know, offshore wind farming, or whatever issue it is. Now, people who will have very high conventional political activism will probably be leaders, people who are running for political office. And just below that, we'll see foot soldiers. These are people who are going to knock on doors, they are going to register people to vote. So they're just below that level of, but again, if you think about leaders, they will do all of those things that are conventional. Sometimes they will do things that are unconventional. Now, there are individuals who will also do some maybe, and I'm not necessarily sure how to maybe characterize this, but George Clooney, who is known more as an actor than as a political activist, was arrested severally outside the White House after chaining himself to the fence, discussing, or like he had really significant interest in the issue of peace in the Sudan. So sometimes you have a single issue activism, and so clearly he wasn't doing, well, maybe it wasn't conventional. It's kind of in the middle between conventional and unconventional. But again, think about George Clooney being arrested. Like that by itself makes news. And so when we sort of think about the single issues and how much people are willing to be engaged, I'm trying to think of this other actor who was significantly involved. Now, moving away from conventional, we go to unconventional activism or unconventional actions. And so when we think about the probably very low levels of unconventional activism, so there are people who don't care about things, even when, for example, you hear the Japanese are, you know, catching probably endangered whales, you're like, well, that's a terrible thing. But what can I do about it? They have whalers and ships and things, and I have. So, you can be like, I really can't do anything about it. Now, if you go to like extremist activism, there are Greenpeace, for example, used to go and try to stop whaling by Japanese ships. And so what they would do is they would go to places where whales have been seen, and they would even ram the whaling ships, which is, I think, if you're in the middle of the ocean and you're ramming someone's ship, that's a little that's a little intense. Now, there are other people who take it to the other extreme, which is very high activism, but also it's unconventional. And this is where we find revolutions, for instance, but also various levels of extremism. And so as you go up the scale of unconventional political activity that is not voting or writing or leadership, or now this doesn't necessarily mean that revolutionaries are not leaders. So you can have very high levels of activism that are revolutionary, that produces leaders. So, for example, think about Mao Zedong, think about people like Lenin. And so they would be in that category of revolutionary, but they are also leaders. But again, we are not, if you sort of think about the regularity of political actions, so leadership entails few. So, for example, if you think about the totality of people who are elected to leadership in the United States, whether they are heads of school districts or mayors or other kinds of people like that, I think I read somewhere it's about 70,000 people. But if you think about all the voting public, at least 150 something million. So again, think about modes of individual political action. And sort of, it's actually easy to place yourself where you might be on this scale. Um, yeah, most of us are probably going to be in either voting or some political engagement. I don't know if we have money, we are going to give money to people. And so this really just interprets that graph. But again, sort of um, think about those axes, very high or very low conventional extent of activism, but also unconventional political activism. Now, sort of thinking about these individual political actions. Now, again, there are individual and group political actions. So we think about foot soldiers, single issue activists, extremist activists, but also political leaders. So people who will do the work, people who will recruit people, who will hold the line, who will. And again, when we are talking about food soldiers, we are not just talking about people who go out there and if you have the money and you can donate $260 million, then you are also a food soldier who becomes a governmentish person, but also is that like an extremist activist. And so, yeah. But revolutionaries will mostly attempt to overthrow existing political order. And I don't know if you would consider someone like Bernie Sanders to be maybe a revolutionary or just a political leader. Um, so again, if we think about how we think about political participation, voting is the most common measure. It's by no means the only measure. In fact, sometimes, but it's probably so. And here's what a former president once said: "It doesn't matter how much you go on the streets and riot and do those kinds of things. Uh, it might change some things, but what really changes government actions is when people vote people into office who then enact laws. So it's great to, and so especially young people have been criticized for doing those things that are fun to do. Think about, for example, last semester if you were here, it was fun to go to like campus vote activities. There's pizza, there's friends, there's but then think about, and this is a critique that has been leveled against younger people. They do the fun stuff but don't vote. Policy doesn't change unless people vote. And so this is how we track people's participation. So like it's very difficult to know who was at this weekend there were rallies protesting a certain individual, but who knows who was there? If I said I was there, how would anyone know? Now, voting has different meanings in different settings, and governments both recognize that this is the way to measure participation, but also have tried different strategies to try and increase voting, both as legitimation of how people vote um, and what that means. Now, I try generally not to quote communists, but Stalin once said that it doesn't matter who votes, what matters is who counts the votes. And so, how the votes are counted determined who. There's an interest in governments for people to turn out to vote. Now, in some countries, for example, now you will note that Vietnam is a communist country. I am surprised that North Korea is not in there. Um, so this maybe past summer I learned about voting in North Korea, and it sounds like a very interesting, interesting thing they do. So the ballot is printed. There's only one candidate, of course, and so you show up. You are given the ballot. You take it, say, from here to the ballot box in the corner. You place it in the ballot box, and then you leave. That is voting. And so in North Korea, you have voter turnout at 100% voting for the right candidate. Now, of course, we probably wouldn't consider that to be voting. But if you think about voter turnout, so for example, I'm surprised at Vietnam. But also, I want you to see what the voter turnout in maybe the US is in there. But the US is at maybe, it's there, 65 to 69, depending on what election is being held. So, for example, the midterm elections, which will be coming next year, hopefully you're planning to vote. They have about between 40 and 49% voter turnout, so about less than half the people who are eligible. And there's a way to decide who is eligible to vote. It's called a voting eligible population will go to vote. Now, so I'd be interested in finding out what they do in Vietnam in order to have such high voter turnout. Now, I want to point to Brazil and Australia. So Australia has a higher voter turnout between 1994. And you'd think that's a good thing because, Australia is a democracy. It's a Western nation. So what is it that they do to get their people to vote? Taxes, fines. If you do not vote, you pay a fine. Same thing with Brazil, even though Brazil has a lower voter turnout. Now, there have been questions asked about whether it's a good thing to fine people for not voting. Because in theory, voting is it's a privilege. It's one of the indicators or the benefits of citizenship, even though sometimes it's not, or in some places it's not just citizens who vote. For example, if you're familiar with this small, maybe I won't call it a village, but I won't call it a city either. Tacoma Park is in Maryland, just outside DC. And so in Tacoma Park, for local elections, all adults can vote. Doesn't matter if you're a citizen or not, and those are local ordinances. Now, you probably know that most elections in the US, only citizens can vote. And so is that necessarily a good thing or not? Is it better to, like if you tax people for not voting, is that necessarily a good thing? Are people voting so that they don't pay a tax, or are they voting because they want to choose their leaders, or are they voting for both reasons? Now, there are other reasons why, for example, some of these voter turnout percentages look the way they do. And if you actually look at quite a number of those countries, the election day is usually a public holiday, not public-ish like it is in Virginia. Virginia has made election day a public holiday, but then sometimes there are workarounds, like you'll be on campus, and then on December 26th you can be at home or something like that. So in countries, for example, Kenya, which I am very familiar with, and as long as I have known about elections there, voting day is a public holiday. Like, school is out, nobody goes to work other than the people who are running the elections. And it's not even Sunday, it's like usually on a Tuesday. So everyone can go to vote. Now, the problem with that is that, for example, there's no same day registration. So you have to register like 3 months before. Now, how many people turn 18 between the 3 months before and the voting day? And are they then disenfranchised because they can't vote? But so these are some of the discussions that go on with the voting. And so some people ask, what if election day in the United States was a public holiday, a true public holiday, like I don't know, like Thanksgiving? Would the voter turnout be higher? But then there are questions of what is the United States trying to achieve with the voting? So if you think about the history of voting in the United States, it has often excluded people. So initially, if you didn't have property, and then, if you are a woman, and then if you are black, and then if you are under 21, so it's almost like voting by exclusion. So what are we trying to do? Now, there are countries, for example, Haiti, that you might ask yourself, why is Haiti's voter turnout at 24%? Countries such as Egypt, why is the voter turnout percentage at 25 to 29? Is it the candidates? Is it the voting? I mean, Vietnam is a communist country, and so is Cuba. Cuba has like, yeah, Singapore isn't really a democracy. It's yeah. So there are these. Cambodia is also a communist country, and you still see this quite a bit of high turnout. So, again, there are always questions of how can you get more citizens to participate, and what does that mean? And so in many, so political participation is not just voting. Voting is one of the things that people do to demonstrate political participation. But as we mentioned, they can turn out in rallies, they can give money, they can volunteer. But again, voting is now in most systems, other forms of political participation are not as important. So I don't know if you ever see protests in France. They always end up with some police action. And it's not like, move back or stay on the side of the street. It's more like tear gas and water cannons and other things. Same thing with most of those other countries that we were looking at. So, in the US, protesting is actually very civil. Like, people, carry placards, and especially if you see like protests on wages and industrial action. But in some countries, you show up on the street. And I want to point to, for example, Iran, where is Iran, which has a 60 to 64% voter turnout. And think about the protests that were going on with Masa Amini and the headscarf and so on. A lot of those ended up in violent action or in imprisonment. And so most of these systems will almost always leave voting as the way to, but again, staying with Iran, the candidates, for example, for president are vetted and authorized by some leadership council. So you are voting on people who have already been selected. There isn't like a lot of freedom of, but in the United States, for example, the number of people who run for president, and I'm sure you probably only know that 2 or 3, or maybe Jill Stein, who runs every other time. But there were probably 19 candidates for president in 2024. So literally anyone can run as long as you can get on the ballot. And so again, voting for most citizens is what they do. But so nonviolent protest activity exists in some places, but probably more in Western nations or democracies rather than in some of those other systems. So protest activity has been increasing for one reason or another. And so if you sort of think about the use of social media, so like if you think about the benefits of social media, they have made organizing much more simpler. Now, in 2024, there were what lots of Kenyans call the finance bill protests, and they were organized by youth. So there was this running joke that older people had no idea when these protests were happening. They had no idea where they were organized. I had no idea where they were organized, and so I would ask my nephews. So is there? So they call them Tuesday something like Fury Tuesdays or something. And so even if you're on social media, like you're on X, you just don't know where they are organizing. But on Tuesday, you see them all in the street. They were not organizing by word of mouth. And so again, think about how people organize protests and how word gets out. Think about, for example, this weekend's protests at Tesla dealerships and how people were like, sometimes you heard about it, but like, where's there a Tesla dealership around here so you can go? Like this. Maybe in DC? This one around here? Well, I mean, I would probably have looked up, but was I going to the maybe I was going in sympathy. But again, so sort of think about political participation. Protests are examples of political participation. Now, so when we think about political participation, we also think about groups. Like, what is it that you have in common with those people that you're participating in a thing with? And so it might be interest, ideology. And so if it's an interest, then that becomes an interest group. So you're united by a common political objective. Now, again, I want to mention that an interest group doesn't have to be political. It can be something else. You can care about birds, like, I don't know, bird watching or hiking. I actually ran into a group of, I don't know if it's an interest group, but these people used to go biking every weekend, like 30 miles or something. But clearly, our interest here is in politics. And so when such an interest group has legislative objectives, then that becomes a political party. And the goal is to influence political decisions by placing members in government role. Now, the United States is a very interesting country because it's maybe a two-party system. If you think about a country like Israel, and I'm not saying this for political reasons, I'm only saying this for the government constitution or composition. There are 120 seats in parliament, and so the leader of the biggest group, parliamentary group, becomes prime minister. Same thing with, for example, the United Kingdom. Now, sometimes you actually don't get the majority. You have to work with other parties. And so when you have to do that, that becomes a coalition government. In the United States, it's, winner take all. Like right now, the other side is like, what can we do? Government is being dismantled, but maybe we can do something with the budget, maybe. And so political parties are the ways people organize in order to gain political action. And so when we think about political and interest groups, the goal is political action. And so sometimes this requires material resources. They might need money, money or goods given to political actors. So, for example, campaigns are expensive to run, and I think the past one cost more than maybe $2 billion. So again, all those ads that you saw, but also a lot of times the political groups sometimes give money for something. I think I was reading today about the oil companies being asked for $1 billion by the current government. I'm not sure what they are. But so if you sort of think about if you contribute, people who contribute, and I hope you are watching the confirmation hearings, which I think are still going on, think about what people give. Think, for example, of the new Secretary for Health and Human Services. He didn't give money, although we don't know if he gave money, but he gave backing to a certain candidate. And so, but he also gave name recognition. If you're a Kennedy, so again, think about what people have, but also think about these cabinet officials who are being vetted and placed in different roles, and some of what they give. And so sometimes we end up seeing bribery and kickbacks, but this next example is actually on the other side. Most of you will know the New Jersey Senator, Robert Menendez, recently found guilty of bribery and or something, kickbacks. The man had like gold bars in his refrigerator. I'm like, is that where you keep them? But actually, maybe more recently and more notably, the current mayor of New York, and the case that was dropped for him to do certain things. So again, when we think about what people give or what people promise or what they say they will do, and so we have to question, especially with the New York situation. There's a lot of questions of is that, but also the guy who is dismantling government. It's sort of like, is that what you do when you give $265 million? Maybe I should find $265 million. So interest groups of the political nature do exchange information. But again, think about, for example, some of the initial moves of this recent political dispensation. Questions of, for example, climate change. So if you are an oil company, you probably don't care very much for the idea that oil in burning fossil fuels causes climate change. And so if you give money to the political class, or if you sponsor studies to say that, human activity is not causing climate change, then you are sharing information that leads to certain outcomes. There are questions, for example, of the relationship between GMO foods and certain things. And I'm actually going to bring in the example of the new Secretary of Health and Human Services questioning vaccines. Now, I don't think that he stands to benefit from anything, but the idea that he is bringing in certain perspectives about health. Well, maybe Texas is in the middle of the biggest polio or maybe measles outbreak or something. Anyway, but so we see some levels of cooperation between political interest groups pursuing their interests. Now, sometimes interest groups and their preferences can lead to them hurting themselves. So, for example, if we think about the past 2-3 weeks and what has happened to government, some people are getting hurt. So, for example, thinking about dismantling the clean energy initiatives, and apparently Texas, after California, has the most solar panels that were being funded by. So you're like, yeah, let's do away with these initiatives, but it's hurting your people. So that's probably not a good thing. Now there can be constraints to group behavior, and I know we're giving them maybe the top. If you think about even people who, for example, want the protection of, I don't know, the bald eagle or something, these are political interest groups. And so sometimes these groups have less resources. So thinking about financial resources, but also political resources, like who do you have that can influence government behavior in favor of your idea? So think about an example of reproductive health, specifically abortion. For example, right now, I don't think you can find anything who can influence this government positively to think about abortion in any kind of positive way. And so this then becomes a constraint on a certain group. But then, does this become an organizing principle? So, for example, everybody's looking at the elections in Virginia to sort of think about what is the future going to look like. So Virginia usually kind of gives a sense of where the midterm elections will go. And I would like to have some predictions on Virginia. I don't know if I can make any this early. But again, if you sort of think about the previous elections, you can sort of see where Virginia is going. But anyway, so constraints on a group's behavior. So decisions of political actors, some people will do what they will do. I don't know that anyone was thinking that the federal government would lose so many workers so quickly or be appended so quickly. But also, sometimes it's also useful to think about our own place in. So, for example, what happens if the Department of Education is dismantled? That's a political, that's a political decision, but it has all kinds of implications. So the political environment can also be a constraint. So think about, for example, even though there are interest groups, and so it is said that the Farm Bureau is probably the second most important lobby group in US politics after the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee. And so if you think about your own life, you probably don't hear about the Farm Bureau. And you're like, what does the Farm Bureau do? Crop insurance, things like selling their produce abroad. So, for example, if you've heard about USAID and it's being taken apart, when the US provides aid abroad, farmers sell their produce to USAID, through the Farm Bureau, and then that food is distributed. And so when you sort of think about even the political environment that now exists with USAID being dismantled, that affects other groups. And so it's interesting to see, for example, what the Farm Bureau will do, or even other interest groups, political interest groups. Now, repressive systems do not have, and sometimes you actually don't find these interest groups. So the question, though, is these interest groups, are they a form of expression or are they a form of corruption? Because if you are giving money to whoever is in power, is it quid pro quo? Even though some people say it's not, they will say it's, political expression, participation, expression of your interests. But there have been questions about whether this is necessarily. Now, so again, when we sort of think about the different types of interest groups, there are associational, institutional, and non-associational, which might become, so, some of them you associate with other people, some of them are institutionalized. So, for example, this become parties, but also non-associational may become social movements. So sort of think about these kinds of things and how people actually present their interests in public, what kinds of things people do, but also political parties as brokers of ideas. Think about their ideologies, think about their pragmatic. Why do I feel like pragmatism? Pragmatism. But also how individuals link with the system, how political parties mobilize people, how they recruit people, how they coordinate just their own operations, and when they take power, then they coordinate government activities. Now, so sometimes when there are new governments, it's often difficult to see what the opposition is. So, for example, in this country, what can we say the opposition is, and what is the opposition doing? Because clearly it's like nothing. Or are the people opposition? So, for example, you would think that the Democratic Party is the opposition. Yeah, you would think it's. But it's important to especially think of parties as agents of political socialization. And now we're in a very interesting moment where parties are not, especially one political party is not, So, think about political parties, political actions, interest groups, and how these pursue their interests. Think about how we are socialized. Think about, and actually next class period we'll be talking about how we are socialized and the avenues of socialization, like the ideas that we have, where do we get them from? So this will be influences on beliefs and actions, which I think we shall begin talking about on